Oh my gosh, it was quite the process. New York has very strict rules for who can operate on DNA data that's generated there. And so the type of work that we do for forensics just wasn't really covered by any of the existing regulations. So it wasn't just going through the approval process. It was essentially coming up with an appropriate approval process for this type of work. So it was years of work to try to, get in touch with the right people and convince them, first of all, that we weren't a standard forensics lab. And so a lot of the traditional approval processes didn't even apply. A lot of them were about really the traditional forensics of comparing one DNA sample to another and demonstrating that you're always going to get the right answer. And that approval process is very important. It's very significant to make sure that labs are doing that right, but that's not what we do. And so even coming up with what is a validation for a lead generation tool was very, very difficult. You don't have necessarily an absolute correct answer. And so a lot of it was coming up with, have we convinced them that what we're doing is correct and accurate? And in the end, they were convinced. We managed to show them that we're getting the right answers, we're getting consistent answers reproducibly, no matter what kind of DNA data we have. And now they're ready to let us work on samples in New York, and that's really, really exciting. There are so many cases in New York that could really use this kind of lead generation, and now we're going to be able to do that.
Yeah, that's great. And having done these cold cases for a little while now, there's plenty that we've already covered where this can certainly turn things, upside down on the investigation. You talk about the process with New York and how it's, there really was no groundwork here because it was so new. How many states total are you currently, working in, certified, permitted to do this work for?
That's a great question. I actually don't know the number. I know we've worked in almost every single state except New York. I don't know off the top of my head which are the last few that we haven't worked in, but New York is the only state that has this type of approval process. And so every other state, from the moment we started offering this technology, we could work there and start solving their cold cases. So we've had solves in many, many, many states at this point. And New York will be next.
New York's finally on board. We like to hear that. So, as far as, speaking non-scientifically, because, a lot of people will be hearing about this for the first time as, it's going to be new to New York. So in a way that anybody could understand, how does this all work? We talk about finding a familial match. What is DNA phenotyping? How do you explain to a layman what it is you do?
Well, it's really an entirely new way to think about forensic DNA. So traditional forensic DNA analysis, you have a DNA sample from a crime scene or from an unidentified body and a reference sample, and you're just comparing one to one. Is this the same person? And traditional forensics is great for that, but that assumes that that person you're interested in testing is either already in a database because they've previously been convicted of a crime, or they're one of the suspects that you're testing. And if it's not one of those people, all you know is that you didn't get a match. That investigator gets his report back every week or every year or whatever from the database that just says, no, we still don't have a match. So without any other information, all they know is that their perpetrator is someone who's not in the database. That's it. No other information to go on. And so they're investigating these cold cases. These may have been cold for decades. Witnesses, their memories are fading. Maybe they're dying. There's just less and less information every day. And what they really need is something new, some new way to generate a lead. And that's what we're doing, is we're treating DNA not just like a fingerprint to say, yes, this is the same person, but actually like a blueprint. It contains information that can generate new leads. So DNA phenotyping is analyzing that DNA and saying, hey, this pattern of DNA, it comes from a blue-eyed person. So we can tell that investigator, if you have someone on your suspect list who has brown eyes, then it's almost certainly not them. It's not 100%. But if you had someone with blue eyes, or 10 people out of 1,000 with blue eyes, that's where you would want to start. And in a lot of these cold cases, that can be enough to say, well, now let's go talk to that person, and suddenly that lead was enough to crack the case open. And with genetic genealogy, it's a little different. Instead of predicting this person has blue eyes and blonde hair and fair skin and is of European ancestry, we take the data from that crime scene and we upload it to a genetic genealogy database. So in this case, that's GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA. Those are the two genetic genealogy databases that allow law enforcement to use them. And what happens is we put that profile in there. We say this is a sample from a law enforcement case. And people in those databases who have opted into law enforcement matching, the database will compare our sample to them and detect whether they share any DNA. And when you share DNA with someone, that means at some point in the past you have a common ancestor that you inherited that DNA from, which means that you're related. And the amount of DNA that you share depends on how distantly related you are. You share a lot of DNA with your siblings because your shared ancestry is your parents. That's very, very recent. But with a third cousin, your shared ancestor is somewhere many generations in the past. And so you only share a little bit of DNA, but that's still something that investigator didn't know. And what our genetic genealogists do is they say, okay, we know our unknown person, this is our unknown perpetrator or an unidentified body, has to be a third cousin with John Smith and has to be a third cousin once removed of Mary Jones, and builds those people's family trees just using public records and tries to figure out who that unknown person could have been. And so all of this is just being done using the DNA and public records. And from that, we've been able to solve well over 100 cold cases. I never know the number because every time I say it, it has changed. I know we just, an hour ago got a notification of another cold case has been solved. I mean, they're always coming in. There's always something new. And that's what's amazing about these technologies.
That really is, in the pieces that we're doing, we draw reference to the Golden State Killer, and how that's sort of an example of this type of technology and helping to, take a mystery of 40 plus years and essentially bring it to a resolution in a matter of months, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The Golden State Killer is not a case that we personally worked on. That was done by other investigators, but that case was the first genetic genealogy solved case that really blew this whole thing open and made it clear that these technologies that C.C. Moore, our lead genetic genealogist, had developed were able to find these unidentified people. And so that was a case that had been cold for decades. And just like many of the cases, or most of the cases that we work on, cold for decades. How many hundreds, thousands of man hours have gone into investigating these cases? And all that they need is one more piece of information. And with genetic genealogy, well, sometimes that piece of information is the guy's name and address, but other times it's, it has to be a descendant of this person who was born in 1799. And well, okay, there's only one person who lived in that area or, who was around at the time, who knew the victim. There's just all of these pieces of information. And that's the magic of these solves, is that we provide one new piece of information with all of the work that agency has done over the decades. And sometimes it's just that last puzzle piece that makes it all fall into place.
What is the time frame typically? Like if a department comes and says, all right, we have this DNA, we have an unsolved crime of 20, 30 years, and they say, we're going to do this to a Parabon. How long? What's the time frame from the time they say they sign on the dotted line, we're doing this, to when they'll get some results back that they can now work with?
So the the agency first coordinates with their lab to actually send us the DNA. So we can't use the DNA profile they've already developed. So we coordinate to have that sent to a lab that we work with. They generate the data. That takes a few weeks, and then we get the results. We get basically a huge data file that says, here's this person's DNA. We analyze it. We typically get results back to them, within a couple months, and what they're going to get is new information about that person, their eye color, their hair color, their skin color, their ancestry, and some information about genetic genealogy. And at that point, they have to decide what they want to do. So the challenge with genetic genealogy is you don't know whether that person is going to have relatives in GEDmatch or in family tree DNA. You don't know that until you try. And so that's one of the things that we have to evaluate first is, sometimes it's happened twice, I think, that the unknown person has had a parent or child in that database, but that basically never happens. That's twice out of, over 500. Most of the time, if we're lucky, we're getting, a third cousin or multiple third cousins. And from there, it's just a lot of research. It's legwork. Our genetic genealogists are just looking through family trees, researching through newspaper archives, trying to put all the pieces together. And so it really depends. The first case that we were able to help solve, I got the DNA results into GEDmatch on a Friday, and by Monday, Cece had the answer. She had that guy's name, and that was a case that had been cold for over 30 years. So, that's just the power of these techniques. Is it's entirely new, but there are others that are still waiting for answers. Yeah, there was a plane going overhead. Maybe that was interfering. I can say that last bit again if you want. Oh, okay. Oh, people are really, really excited. At every conference that I would go to, and when I would give a talk, people from New York would come up to me and say, when are you going to be able to work with us? Why is this so hard? Can't you just get approval? And we would have to explain, well, it's a process, and they're still trying to figure out how to approve us. But now that we finally have that approval, people are really, really excited. They're lining up their cases. We're getting lots of inquiries, lots of DNA submissions, and so I think we're going to see a lot of solved cases coming out of New York very soon.
All right, that's great. That's what I know we're all hoping to hear. Paula had mentioned that. I don't know if you're able to talk about this aspect, but a couple of the smaller departments around here who have unsolved cases that we profiled, they've said, "Gosh, this would be perfect. We don't have that kind of money around. We're hoping that the state will help, or that there's some other outfit somewhere that can help afford the cost." But then Paula said that you guys are working on like a crowdfunding resource.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there are lots of options for funding. We do see agencies working together or working with the DA's office. There's a lot of government funding. There are cold case grants. We also work a lot with the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative, which is just a huge amount of federal funding to help clear sexual assault kits and analyze that DNA. And then also we have we also have a new undertaking called Justice Drive, where agencies can post their cases and ask for the public to donate to them. And they can then use those funds for whatever they want. So if they have a case and they need to raise some money, we've had several successful cases at this point get enough funding to go forward with DNA analysis. They can post it and post about their victim and talk about how important it is to them to solve this case. And then, people can chip in $1 here, $10 there, and eventually, they'll have enough to do that next analysis and hope that maybe they can get that answer.
I know it really depends on, the individual case, but if you had to give like a ballpark, like if the local department was wondering, well, from what to what, like what's the low to what's the high cost that somebody might...
So the all-in cost for the DNA analysis, which will include phenotyping, a genetic genealogy analysis, all of that together is $6,000. And so that sounds like a lot, but when it comes to the number of man hours that have been spent on these cold cases, it's really a drop in the bucket. And that's generally what we hear from detectives is that's all it's going to cost me to get a new lead in this case that I've been trying to solve for 30 years. I mean, it's just a little bit, but those smaller agencies, it can be difficult to find those funds, and that's where things like Justice Drive can come in and really help put them over the top to get this analysis done.
All right, that's great, and I think I'm sure some of these departments might say, can we post the story that was done on our cold case as well to have people get familiar with it? So maybe they'll put those out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially with a lot of these smaller agencies, they might just have that one cold case that has been hanging over the heads of every detective that has come through that agency. And that some new detective comes in and says, you know what, I want to be the one to solve this case. All I need is $6,000 and maybe I can do it.
Yeah. Well, I know several of them that we've spoken to look at this as, you know, their best opportunity so far. So if you haven't heard from them already, I'm sure you will. Dr. Greytak, thank you so much. I don't want to take up more of your time. I think we got everything that we need for the pieces we're working on for next week.
Great.
And hopefully we will hear more from you guys in the not too distant future about things being resolved up here in New York.
Yeah, I sure hope so. So I should say that the initial cost for the lab work is $1,800. That includes the DNA analysis, phenotyping, and we upload it to GEDmatch and have CC Moore look at it to see if it looks promising. And then the agency decides how they want to proceed.
So it starts at least 1,800, and then depending on what they want to do, it goes up from there.
Yes.
Is that?
Yes.